I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zies Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Welcome to the show, everybody.
Welcome to Arcane Mark. Today we're going to be talking about randomness and emergent gameplay. Starting off with the part of randomness that folks probably think of most when they're thinking of this sort of game, which is the D20 or the D10 or the D6s or the fudge dice.
Or the cards or whatever the random part of the game is.
Whatever you're using to make sure that you are telling a story where there is a chance of success and failure as opposed to a story where the PCs automatically
win. Yes. So there are many different things that people talk about when they talk about randomness in games. And the first step of randomness in games is that, well, most of the tabletop RPGs we play are random in some way. Not all. There's some where literally everything is just decided by the people who are playing. You don't roll anything randomly. You don't draw any random cards. It's deterministic. But many tabletop RPGs have some element of randomness. And the first step of randomness, like Linda said, is the core mechanic of the game's randomness that introduces to things. Is there a chance for a success versus a fail forward or even a fail backward? Is there a chance that some bad consequences are going to happen to someone or something that someone in the game is invested with?
And is that result simply success or failure, or is there some concept of, then you're going to roll on some other table to determine what happens, or, there are different types of succeeding or failing at a task, by a little bit or by a lot, like critical success and critical failure in Pathfinder.
That's right. It tends to be that the more different results that can happen on a roll, give the more sort of richness and possibilities, and the more sort of narrative power it gives to whoever's describing the results to sort of tailor things. If you have a binary yes-no, the problem with it is the same as the problem with like rating games on Steam, where it's like, well, I wish I could give anything other than the thumbs up and the thumbs down as the options. That's a problem with success failure gameplay that doesn't have other results. It's one of the reasons I push so hard for 4 degrees of success in Pathfinder 2e. I would probably say of the things that I wanted to get into the game, it was the one that I made the most of a sort of a case for, because some of the other ones, it was just like people were like, oh yeah, obviously let's try that, or it was like, oh yeah, sure, there's no reason not to, but there was reasons for and against. And I feel that having more possible outcomes leads to a lot of richness in a lot of ways, because once you only have the choice of success fail, even though you could fail forward, it strictly limits down the kinds of things that you can have, because there has to be one that's sort of the paradigmatic success and the paradigmatic failure. And so at that point, you sort of see what they look like, and it gives you fewer options than, say, storyteller system where you get some number of successes at a certain difficulty, and only after 3 do you really get a total success.
Yeah. I say wanting the ability to grade the results baked into the system rather than leaving it all for the GM to muck with. Absolutely. Although even if it isn't baked into the system, there are some cases where it's easier than others to introduce it for things that are more like narrative, whereas trying to introduce that kind of thing into something more strictly mechanical like combat would be really tough. But if you were like, okay, yeah, in the same way that, one that you often see is if people roll a natural 1, the GM describes them as flubbing things up really badly, or they roll a natural 20, then the GM gives them a nod.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can have dice pools where the number of successes means better success, or like where you take a certain number of the dice, the highest, or add them up, and after a certain threshold, you get better and better successes. Of course, there's Pathfinder 2, where succeeding by 10 or more give you a critical success, and failing by 10 or more is a critical failure. There's all sorts of options that you have in the game to decide what the random results will mean, even when designing a game. But this is not the design diary, it's GM tools. So ultimately we're going to assume that you have selected a game already.
And the
that
game has a randomness
certain
mechanic.
randomness mechanic that's already in it. So one of the aspects that we're going to be talking about today is emergent gameplay. That's the gameplay that you didn't expect, that you didn't presuppose, that came about through randomness. And when people talk about it, they often talk about a higher level or more in-depth randomness, like even the randomness to decide what even happened in the story.
Mm-hmm.
But there is emergent gameplay that comes about due to trusting and allowing the dice to decide what's going to happen, even if you completely deterministically selected all of the story elements.
Yeah. So this can be when players you expect that they're probably going to succeed at something, but the dice just don't go their way and they need to do another approach. Or
they're fighting a group of kobolds and they just keep, PCs roll so many natural ones. Or the kobolds roll so many natural 20s. They used to have picks because kobolds were like mining spirits back in the day. And when we were doing the Pathfinder playtest, we had one playtest where just the GM was on fire. The kobolds rolled so many natural 20s and picks being a fatal weapon.
yes.
These little kobolds that were supposed to be a trivial encounter were like, one particular kobold who got 3 crits had dropped like all but one party member. And it was down to that last kobold versus the last party member. And the party member kept rolling like 2 and 3. And so this is an example of an emergent story, even though the kobold encounter was a completely planned encounter. Nothing in it had been selected randomly up until that point, but the dice for the normal determinism of like attack rolls and other checks turned it into a weird story that I'm now telling you today.
Yeah, and those can be the kinds of moments where characters become very afraid of a particular type of creature, vastly outsized to its strength. Like we had a player whose character was afraid of Sturges up until he's level 12 and he's still afraid of Sturges.
I don't even actually think that was because the Sturges were rolling better than they were supposed to. This was in Pathfinder 1. I think it was because they did con damage.
Oh, right.
And
yeah.
with a touch attack. And they just need to hit your touch AC, and then they did con damage. That's right. Why he was afraid of them. Okay. Because if enough of them were there, they would deal all of his con. It's the same reason that some of you guys were afraid of Greater Shadows in another campaign when you didn't have Death Wards up.
Greater Shadows and Sugathi.
kept showing up. But Sturges, because it bypassed traditional defenses, as opposed to that one being a random one. But there have been situations where randomness has led to characters having particular opinions, like, oh, these guys must be immune to this type of effect because they just kept rolling so high on a saving throw against, I think it was like rocks falling on them, that one of my characters was just like, they've got to be immune to this. There's no way they would take 0 damage. And I saw on the dice out of character. Or actually, Linda didn't show me the dice, but Linda claimed out of character that they were all critically succeeding.
Yes.
But all I saw in character was that I was dropping rocks on them with a reflex save.
They kept rolling 17 or above.
And they were taking 0 despite being a swarm. So it was like, maybe this swarm is immune to rocks.
Yeah.
Immune to bludgeoning. I guess I'll use my
Their attack rolls weren't so hot.
My electric arc, which is actually worse against swarms than the AoE bludgeoning attack.
For that encounter.
That's true.
But yeah, another one that you often have with emergent gameplay and success and failure is characters believing incorrect information and then making decisions based on it. So, whether it is directly baked in with the critical failure mechanic, or like you're doing it on a failure, like I highly recommend experimenting with incorrect assumptions and incorrect information and having the characters believe different things based on what they've gathered, because it's so much fun when they get together and they're like, oh yes, and then they try to act on the information. It's just like, whoop. And you can have these misconceptions that persist across many levels because it just doesn't come up again, and then it comes up again at just the right time.
So when we're talking about the core randomness of the game, we should talk about some of the discussions of variance.
Yes.
And as Dex Starglow mentioned in chat, if you have multiple dice that you're adding together, that lowers the variance, which means that you'll have a more predictable outcome, and the sort of edge cases are much less likely than the average case. Whereas if you have one die, then they're all equally likely. Other than the fact that, like, if you say the edge case has to be so high up on the die that you need to roll a high number, it's less likely. But it's only less likely because of that reason, and any of the given values are equal.
And similarly, if you have a multi-dice system where you're not doing, like, the sum of all the dice, but you're doing, like, count the number that are at least...
Yes. Count the number of dice that are at least at a certain threshold tend to be significantly swingier than summing them all, because of the fact that when you sum, like, all the highs and lows go together, whereas when you're taking the ones that are a success, you just, like, you know, sure, law of large numbers, it's better, it's still better in terms of being less variable than just rolling one gigantic die, but it's somewhere in between.
Exactly.
And if you have something like the storyteller system where ones count as a -1 instead of a 0, and tens count as a 2 instead of a 1, that can actually be very swingy in its own right, because of the fact that you just get a few tens and with no ones, or a few ones with no tens, and you suddenly have a result that is very, very high.
Yes, very, very high or very, very low.
Or very, very low.
Then you can but that really lends itself to, like, extreme situations where, like, this character tries to bamboozle another character and fails so badly that they end up working for the other character for free for a long period of time, or, like, oh yeah, and you get all these kinds of really bizarre things that come out of that when you go far beyond the expected result.
That's right. I think that I don't know what the exact curve looks like for those, but it's, like, somewhere where it is slightly more likely that you'll get a more average result. But those ridiculously outrageous results are still, like, definitely on the map, especially if you have an ability to explode the tens.
Yes.
And have them roll again. Then, like, absolutely outrageous results in that direction are definitely.
And then
the
more, and then, like, the smoother, and then, like, the more results that are successes versus failures, then the smoother that it gets, as opposed to when it's like, oh yeah, you know, most of my successes are tens and therefore they double and explode or whatever.
Yep, it gets very spiky very quickly.
But it's still in between in general.
Right. And so basically, when you're thinking about what kind of system you're using and what kind of randomness you're using, that will determine what kind of emergent stories you're going to tell. If you want to tell a story where David beats Goliath more often, then usually a randomness that is not a bell curve is better. Whereas if you want to tell a story where it's just Goliath goes in day after day, beats up all the Davids, I mean, it's Goliath, then you're probably are better off with a bell curve because it's more consistent.
Yeah, and in those types of stories, you know, PCs can more reliably do the things that they're pretty good at, but they're less likely to, like, because they're less likely to totally flub it up, but you're also less likely to have extreme success as well.
That's right.
So.
And there are some systems that, like, kind of don't go all the way up into a bell curve, into the biggest possible bell curve of adding everything together by being like, take your best one or take your best two and add them up or something like that. And when you have those systems, it is a little more swingy than a bell curve, because once again, it is a bell curve, but it's a little more swingy than a add the sum of all of the dice together, because of the fact that you are kind of shaving off some of the reverting to the mean by just taking away all of the dice except one. But it also leads to results that are kind of predictable in certain ways and allow people to make guesses about what they want to do based on the number of dice that they're rolling. So, and obviously when you have a card-based system, then you have to think about whether it is with or without replacement, and if so, when you shuffle. Because a card-based system, much like a system with, like, popsicle sticks or something like that, that is sometimes used in playtesting D20 systems so that you don't get all ones or all 20s and throw things off, due to the lack of replacement until a certain point, unless you do replace every time and shuffle every time, certain results become more likely when you haven't seen them in a while.
Yes.
And therefore, everything does revert back to the mean, almost automatically assuming that everybody wants the same
Because if you
cards.
keep drawing through the deck, it's like, oh, we're eventually going to get a natural 20 here.
That's assuming that everybody wants the same cards.
Yes.
Now, in some of those systems, like there was a system that Jason Keeley worked on with some of his buddies that was based on the tarot deck. And if I recall correctly, in that one, you could wind up being reversed, where all of the ones that you wanted are the opposite of what most people wanted. Plus, there were people who had different thresholds for which tarot cards were good for them. And for instance, my character was like an elf / blue fairy, because it was a Pinocchio one-shot. And all of my abilities were obscenely powerful, but the tarot deck hated me, and many tarot cards that would have been fine for anyone else were bad for me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got reversed, so that was like somewhat canceled out temporarily. And so at that point, it doesn't necessarily revert to mean, right? Because if the blue fairy draws the ones that she's reversed and she wants and everyone else doesn't want, and then they draw the ones that she now doesn't want but that they want, then maybe everything is very lucky for the party. Whereas if she's drawing the ones other people wanted that she now doesn't want, it could be just super bad for the party. But assuming that your deck is something like the PCs are sharing a deck that has like success and in it some number of times, critical success some number of times, or even you can even think of a deck that has different amounts of degrees of success, or even has interesting different narrative statements in the deck that you shuffle up, and one of them is like, you succeed, but you must propose a cost for it, and you draw it out, and each of them determines what you do next.
Or you succeed and you create an opportunity for the next player.
That's right. And so if you have one that's shared and does the same thing for everyone, it'll naturally revert to the mean over time, unless the GM / an adversary player is using the same deck and they can possibly draw all the successes, in which case it actually can lead to a death spiral. Mm-hmm. So that's one way that cards are different than dice when it comes to the base randomness of the game. Altogether, you can consider the way that base randomness leads to different emergent gameplay, but when people talk about emergent gameplay, more often they're talking about gameplay that happens when you're willing to use dice to decide the kind of foundational facts about what's going to happen next that are often chosen by, like, the GM in between sessions with planning the next adventure, or the published adventure that you have purchased and are running right now, or at least something like that.
Yeah. So one of the most stereotypical examples of this is the random encounter table, a chart that has a large number of monsters on it, and then the GM rolls and it tells the GM what monster to consider using. But you can use randomness for a wide variety of things. You can use it for things like weather conditions. You can use it for things like treasure. You can use it for things like, the nature of a dungeon. There's books out there that'll be like, oh yeah, you can even use it for building stories, where it's like motivations or NPCs or like plot hooks or things like that.
Absolutely. And so this is what leads to what most people talk about in emergent gameplay. It's also very commonly seen as a major feature of OSR style games, but you can absolutely use it in Pathfinder 2, 5e, or any kind of game that is more typically played with a pre-published adventure or a pre-planned adventure. Mm-hmm. All you need is some tables to roll on, which either you created ahead of time, in which case it's kind of like you came up with all of these ideas and you're just deciding when to deploy them and how they get deployed, or that you find, like Linda said, it's some kind of book of tables. Even some RPGs that are more emergent might have tables that very much work for any RPG when you come down to it.
And I find that rolling beforehand outside of the session usually works better, because then you have time to prep the things that come around it, and also considering scrapping ideas that just really aren't a good fit. If you roll and a random encounter with monsters,
ugh,
Yeah. Then
This
don't run
is
it.
not the right thing to do right now. Roll again. That's okay. You don't have to be completely beholden to the die roll, because the emergent gameplay and the die roll, some of these randomizations are there to spur your creativity.
Yeah. So then the idea is that if you say, okay, I know that I want there to be an encounter while the PCs are on the journey from this place to this place. I'm gonna try rolling a die. I'm gonna try rolling and checking this chart and seeing what does that get me. And it's like, oh, okay, I rolled kobolds. Okay, what's the deal with these kobolds? Okay, they're a nomadic group of kobolds, and they are goats, and they have these other things going on or whatever. And you can come up with different ideas about what makes that encounter, feel different from you pull out the bestiary and have the most stereotypical version of that encounter. What are you going to put there in terms of like the terrain? What are you going to put there in terms of the setup to make it feel interesting? Because I definitely agree that when it's just like, oh, it's a random encounter, the GM pulls out the book, the GM rolls a random monster, you fight the monster on a grassy plain, you defeat the monster, congratulations, you win. That that's not very interesting.
Especially if it's just something that was like grassy plain encounters. From a book that just had any encounters for grassy plain. They didn't even say what level it would be. Or perhaps you're lucky enough that it said grassy plain encounters levels 1 to 3 PCs. But those are not necessarily the most interesting way to do random encounters. In fact, they're usually the least interesting way. When you're making a random encounter table, even more so than a table with like random personalities or motivations, secret motivations for NPCs, or like a random dungeon idea generator that will give you like adjectives that you throw together, and it'll be like the frozen cave of wealth. And it's like, oh, okay, so it's frozen, it's a cave, and it is full of wealth. But those can help, but a random encounter generally is better if you created that table full of encounters that you thought were like relatively interesting ideas. Maybe because you took some of them off of a random encounter table that you found. So for instance, let's say there was those plains encounters from levels 1 to 3. Instead of rolling on that, I would recommend look through them, look through all of them, and see which ones are, well, your group was level, say, 3. Yeah. See which ones are mostly for level 1 and are, like, easy enough that you might not want to roll them unless you're looking for a trivial encounter, in which case you may want to put them in a separate place.
Yeah.
Or if you're level 1, similarly, the ones that were hard ones for level 3 that was on this table, maybe you take those off. Look for ones that don't fit the theme pacing, or just even just don't seem like they were that good. Sometimes when people are making a for mass publication table that has lots and lots of entries, some of them just aren't going to fit.
It'll be like a creature that doesn't live in that area, but you can still use it for inspiration if it's like, okay, yeah, I rolled a lion. That doesn't mean I must pull lion out of the bestiary. That might mean I'm going to throw I'm going to put a little variant on it and throw like a feline opponent at the PCs.
Right. And then once you've removed some things from the table, you see what you've got left. Think, is this all? Is there something that's missing? Think about the special plot elements of your story, and then think of some non-essential encounters that are related to what's going on right now, and what's related to the actual story in certain ways, but that you don't really need. And then you can throw those on the random table as well. Like, let's say they were on these grassy plains because they're heading to a bandit hideout that's actually headed by an evil alchemist who's, like, experimenting on monsters. So maybe you have alchemically altered monsters that are some of the random encounters that were, like, either unleashed because the alchemist was like, whatever, I'm done with this experiment, I don't care about this anymore, or they escaped from the alchemist cages.
Whenever you have these encounters, think about what can that encounter tell the PCs about the area, or how can it build into the story. And if the answer is nothing, then you might want to pick a different one or come up with something else that's going on with it. So even like an animal encounter might tell you like, oh, these lions or whatever are not normally found this close to the road. What happened? Did something larger drive them off? Did the regular patrols here aren't available? Like, if you can have a question that's left after these kinds of encounters, it's more interesting. Or like, did the PCs find like an overturned caravan that had gotten attacked by the dire lion, and then they can find things in there that leads to some other plot hook.
That's right. Sometimes when you roll on a random encounter table, one that maybe you've curated in advance to make sure it doesn't have any complete stinkers for you, and you get something that's still like, you're like, at first, see if you can yes and or yes but the thing that you roll to be like, okay, well, maybe there's some other element at play or something else going on that makes this make more sense. If you can't, then just roll again. That's fine.
And one of the times you definitely want to roll again is if it feels very similar to things that they've already done. Like, you don't want to be like, oh, we've done a bunch of encounters with plants recently, and this would be a very similar one to something we've already done.
You could even consider that as, like, a random encounter table as, like, a list of things that are in that area, and if they rolled that same plant monster already, maybe they killed the one that was there. Maybe that means that they don't have to fight anything if they roll that again.
Maybe instead of finding that plant monster again, they find like the plant monster's lair because they continue to explore. They find something else that's about that story.
Some mulch that's made out of dead adventurers that were eaten there, and some of it has items in it, and they get a reward for having previously defeated the plant monster in advance.
There's a comment there. I thought that random encounters are only there to make sure that the PCs don't rest excessively. They can certainly be used for that purpose of stringing together locations if you have set piece areas that are pretty small and you want to make sure that you're adding something to the beginning or the end that isn't directly associated with what's going on.
You can have games where random encounters are directly created as a sort of push-pull with resting or something else. For example, for better or for worse, one of the camping mechanics in the Kingmaker Pathfinder 2e, the only actual factor really that stops you from just using those camping mechanics to do tons of stuff on every night is that you eventually will get a random encounter if you keep doing it with very high probability. And that's just sort of how the way that particular push and pull works. So you can have systems where random encounters are sort of the punishment for something. I think that can lead to some issues where you wind up people
are like,
fishing,
oh man, we have an encounter.
Or you wind up fishing for fights if you're not running milestone XP to try to get more XP and be like, that wasn't a punishment at all because our group doesn't use daily resources, so we didn't mind having that fight. In fact, let's have more fights. It's only a problem out of character where you run out of table time because you're running the encounters.
Or the players are like, I'm sick of encounters.
Right.
But the characters are like, but they're also like, I want more XP.
That's true. So even in those cases, you can think of alternate penalties to give that are not an encounter, and then maybe even worse than an encounter where it's just like, yeah, you did this for so long and then like rot spoiled some of your supplies or something like that.
Yeah. I think another thing to consider with the random encounter tables is that rather than entirely striking off the options that are too low level or too high level, you can consider having those options manifest in a different way. So you can say, okay, you know, the higher level one, you don't encounter the creature, but you see signs of the creature. Or you talk to someone who has encountered the creature. And then the lower level one, maybe it's a lower than trivial encounter. And it's one of those, okay, you know, ask the players, how do you win this encounter?
Right.
Because you don't want to have a situation where the world feels like it only ever contains creatures that are appropriately leveled for the PCs to fight.
That's absolutely true. And David Nielsen points out something important about randomness is that our perception of randomness is that if you are doing something random, it's more like actually a card draw deck that has all the numbers from 1 to 20. Our perception is if you keep rolling random things, you'll see a bunch of different outcomes all about the same amount of time. Whereas actually randomness means that you're occasionally going to get some things that look really suspicious and as if it wasn't randomized correctly.
The players, if the players don't really stare at your dice and be like, really, are you sure you rolled that randomly suspiciously? Then you haven't been playing long enough.
If your dice are just always very, very, it'd be like, oh yeah, you know what? I just rolled 100 times. I got 4 to 6 of every die roll from 1 to 20 when I did that.
That's actually very ridiculous suspicious.
There should be some number that you just rolled a ridiculous amount of times. And David pointed out that means that you could get the hardest thing repeatedly. That's something that's some weird thing like that. You don't know what it's going to be in advance.
Something weird is going to happen, and then that helps to tell the story when you see the pattern of what appeared a lot.
Right.
So, if you got that same plant monster again, you may not want to run that same encounter, but maybe instead you could choose to run an encounter with a different plant monster, and then you keep rolling plant monsters, and you're telling a story of, like, why are there so many plant monsters in this region?
Exactly. So I'd say that the dichotomy of emergent gameplay versus completely curated gameplay is something you can play with as a GM, and you can toy with that and the expectations to allow you to create something that is a hybrid that's stronger than either one alone. Obviously, if you just randomize everything and you're not willing to even put some of your own interpretation into it and you just roll tables and you completely accept everything that's in every table, and then you roll another table and you make no decisions, that's a little bit degenerate. Whereas on the other side, if everything is pre-planned by you in advance, to a certain point, it could be a railroad where it's just like, yes, all of these outcomes are predetermined. I'm not even going to allow anything to throw that.
And when
off.
it comes to the outcomes overall, like, until a truth is definitively known by the players, it's not necessarily a truth. Like, you may have planned to have some other explanation for what was going on here in the forest, but then you roll the 80 bajillion plant monsters, and so you've decided, okay, what is consistent with the information I've given the PC so far? Having some kind of, like, malevolent fungal growth deep beneath the earth that was actually influencing things is not inconsistent, would also explain these sorts of things that are going on.
Or if you already hinted somewhat that there was like a fire demon that was going to be unleashed, maybe an angry druid was so mad that people were trying to release the fire demon that angry druid started creating dangerous plant monsters to go after the cultists and the villagers who allowed this cult of fire demons to come there, and it's just attacking everyone indiscriminately. And now you've added you're not getting rid of the fire demon because you had some clues towards it in advance, even though you didn't reveal that all yet. But now there's two factions that are both dangerous to the PCs, that are both in the forest, all because you rolled so many random plants.
But one of the roles of random encounters, too, which Garland, I think, was alluding to a bit, is including encounters that don't relate to the overall narrative. So, like, one of the values of this style of encounter is if it's, like, kind of a break from the standard expectation. And if it's telling you something new about the area, it's not necessarily like, oh, yes, and that's related to the whole, like, this boss thing we're going to be doing later. It might just tell us, like, something small or interesting about this place.
Doesn't even have to be a fight.
Doesn't have to be a fight.
Right? It could just be a merchant caravan that's coming through that you thought about ahead of time. You weren't sure exactly when they would find it, and you thought about what kinds of items and things it would offer, and you rolled it on the encounter, and hey, there's a merchant caravan. Now
things that add, like, a little more color and spice to the world, and potentially give the PCs a chance to grab onto something.
Yep. And you know what? Just because we're making a DM Tools episode about randomness and emergent gameplay does not mean that any particular amount of randomness and emergent gameplay may be right for you. Some GMs don't like to be surprised, as Garland is mentioning in the chat. Some GMs do. Some GMs delight in being surprised and improvising based on results that they never would have expected. Depending on your style, you can still find a level of randomness that probably will improve your game, but that might not be nearly as much as another GM who prefers to have more randomness in the decision-making process. And maybe you have a style where you don't want any randomness at all, and that's okay, especially if you're very decisive and you're full of ideas. You might not need it.
You might just be like, oh, I don't need this things for inspiration. I can come up with whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like Kojo was also watching a encounter building show on DM's Lair that had me on it and said it's arcane mark all the way down. So let's see. People are also talking about whether or not session pacing and like day pacing within an adventure is even necessary, and that also depends on group and GM style. Some groups don't care, or even are just like, yeah, whatever. It doesn't matter if it takes us 100 days to clear out this dungeon that the game thinks we were going to do in like 4 or 5 because there wasn't a doomsday clock that said the world was going to end in 100 days. Whereas other people are like, is my character really patient enough to spend 100 days on this?
Or you can also have differences where, like, there are different character builds that do better on shorter days versus longer days. And so, like, if people can just Nova and, like, the wizard goes in and casts their highest level spells and is like, everyone, we must rest. Whereas the characters who are built to be able to last for a long period of time then feel like they're not contributing as much.
Also, just, like, imagine that this was your actual job. And admittedly, there's a push and pull. It depends on how paranoid you are. Maybe you wouldn't have had that job if you were worried of dying because it's a very dangerous, deadly job.
Yes.
And you are a wizard. And you needed some money. Or for whatever reason, you're going off into this dungeon. There's no time pressure, not really to save the world, but I mean, your thesis research needs to be done at some point back at the academy. So the question is,
you haven't seen your family in a while. You've been here for a while. You've been sleeping in this random tent outside. You haven't had a proper shower in ages.
You have to sleep on the ground instead of in your nice room back at the academy. Now, do you spend 100 days over 3 months? One fight a day using all of your magic? Or will you try to do it in 5 days like your other adventures are all telling you easily could do, maybe even in 3? Maybe you are just like, no, I must not die. I don't care about how. I don't care if it takes over 3 months. I'm not dying out here because then I can't go back to my research ever or my family ever. But a lot of people probably would accept the risk if they're willing to accept the risk at all, and not stay out there for that amount of time. And so, as part of the role playing game, you also have to ask yourself, are you role-playing your character to that extent anyway? Or are people kind of just, like, moving the pieces on the board and just being like, well, my piece will make me lose if I don't, like, give myself the maximum resources each time. So, therefore, I don't care how long I have to spend in character because I'm not doing it
Sitting
myself.
and thinking about, like, you know, how comfortable is your PC? How patient is your PC? Can give you a lot of interesting things if you're like, yes, you know, of course it would be optimal to continue to have my character do this for a lot of days, but you know what? She hasn't had a day off in a while. She's probably tired. She, instead of doing her training today, she goes and has fun with her friends. You know, it can lead to a lot of things, and I think one of the topics on our poll, which we can talk about later, will relate to this as well.
That's right. So, moving back to ways that we can use randomness to create emergent gameplay, we talked a lot about encounters and deciding when and where encounters can happen. But you can even use randomness to help build out dungeons, not only in terms of what rooms exist and where they are by finding random tables that discuss dungeon features, but even you can have dungeon denizens who don't just live in one room, but you can randomly decide where they're going, where they're kind of a wandering monster instead of a random encounter, where it's like, this thing hunts within these 4 rooms, and it's randomly determined which one of the rooms that they're in, with different probabilities based on, like, maybe what time of day they're more likely to be hunting in one of these rooms if it's the night. Whereas there might be almost certainly asleep in their lair in the early morning or something like that. You can use randomness similarly to determine the NPCs that are found back at town, and that's a good way to keep the NPCs interesting when the PCs get interested in someone that was just a throwaway character that you created. You can sort of see if you can randomly generate some kind of secret or interesting tidbit.
And in these cases, I think that it can be more powerful for some of these more general ideas to use tables that you did not simply generate yourself, because they're more likely to create combinations that you wouldn't have thought of, or ideas that you wouldn't have thought of, or things that aren't part of your usual stereotypical patterns that then have you thinking outside the box and trying something new.
Sure. And one thing you can do with that is start with a table that somebody else came up with, and then add a couple things that are specific to what you want to do.
So cut out a few things that are like, that really doesn't work for this area or the setting.
So, for example, let's say we're talking about we rolled all those plant encounters. There was fire demon cult, and then there's this like druid who's just attacking everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So, and making all these plants. So maybe we have a table of secrets, and we replace two of them with being in the fire demon cult and being part of the wants to kill everyone now because of angry about the fire druid cults, fire demon cult druid circle. So someone who's from the angry plant druid circle or the fire demon cult are now two of the things that could be the secret of certain villagers that you can roll.
Yeah.
And if you roll a secret for a villager that just doesn't make sense or that you don't like it, where you're like, no, this character's a sweetheart. They're not going to be actually trying to get the fire demon. You have two choices, or you have several choices, but two main choices. One is roll again because you didn't like that, or two is find a way to make it fit, whereas like maybe they are a sweetheart, but maybe they don't really want to help the fire demon cult, but they're being blackmailed because their little sister is kidnapped by the fire demon cult, so they are an asset for the fire demon cult
unknowingly, or maybe unknowingly, if
Yes.
something else is going on, or maybe they've been replaced by a shapeshifter. Or you don't want to use that one too often, but you could use it occasionally.
You could be like, yeah, maybe it's a shapeshifter right now. There's
Or maybe the fire demon cult is threatening them or scoping them out in some way, or maybe the fire demon cult has been spying on them and using information that they've been gathering or things like that.
And maybe the one that you rolled for the plant druid, the angry plant druid of this person who loves civilization and also wouldn't work with them. Maybe like they plant druid grew spores inside of them that when they go to sleep they wake up and do things for the plant druid and they're not doing it on purpose. So you can come up with something like that. Now, Chris Abbott, thank you in chat, said, thanks to Mark and Linda for all the great content creation and the fun of working with chat to add content to the game.
Oh, thanks for the sub, and you're very welcome. The workshops are a lot of fun.
So there's always a way to make these seemingly inconsistent roles work by coming up with some kind of like deep lore or explanation, or just roll again and be like, nah, that's not the right one.
Because you don't necessarily want to have a ton of like complicated deep lore that doesn't really make sense, because then it's like, if there's a lot of exceptions in one area of the setting, it can kind of feel to the players like, oh, this doesn't really make sense. Oh, but there's actually this reason it's harder to grok it. So, like, if you're rolling a lot of those in a row, you're probably going to want to just reroll some of them. So
I mean,
like,
maybe you can keep them all.
Or make it part of the story where it's like, okay, it's a thing that the demon cult that has this kind of thing going with is blackmailing everyone, or it's a thing that the druid circle puts spores in people or whatever, and then you choose to double down on it and make it like this is a major plot point and you can follow.
If you keep rolling things that all don't seem to work, maybe they're not all the same one. One person who really shouldn't be with the fire demon cult rolled that, and their sister is being blackmailed. One of them who really shouldn't be with the druid rolled that and has spores inside. One of them rolled a thing that said that they're secretly out of money, and they were someone who obviously has a ton of money, and the PC just gave them money, and you had to come up with some weird thing where it was like counterfeit money.
Yeah, they're deeply in debt, and the
collectors come in. Maybe you got 12 things that all didn't make sense and that you had to figure things out, and that's okay because, like Garland said, life can be pretty random seeming. It's even true that if your players know that you're using the tables and you rolled all these randomly, it's not like they're going to accuse you of being, like, trying to M. Night Shyamalan yourself, where everything is such a what a twist.
Yeah.
Be like, look, I just rolled these. They were all on the exact worst possible NPC for them, and so these twists, that was what the dice said, as opposed to, like, if you chose and you just chose everybody to be the exact subversion of expectations, they'd be like, wow, you just wanted to subvert everything, didn't you?
So that is another thing that using random tables affords you, as players being like, oh, yeah, the randomness did this weird thing. And not, like, you just making this up. And then it gives them a sense that it can give them a sense that the setting is more dynamic in that way, where, like, just weird stuff doesn't happen. Because, you know, because it's just like, it reminds me of the problem. What was it called? The one where like no two people have the same name in stories.
Exactly. Where it's like you can only have one like Bob.
There's one Bob and no one else has the name. Even if a book lists the surname if first name is common, then like nobody other than one person is gonna have it. Because you try so hard in building things to naturally to like avoid overlaps unless there's a tidy story to wrap things up.
There's only one Bob. Everybody is single, so your PCs can date them.
That's correct.
And
this area, everything's sorted into like these level appropriate regions.
Yep. There's lots of unusual and interesting things that are going on there. But yeah, I would say that ultimately your players, if they know things are coming from randomness, also like you said, Linda, they'll know it's like, no, I wasn't just trying to do what a twist. Or like, let's say there's a random table of 100 secrets, and one of them is that like this person is secretly a fascist.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you rolled that for like everyone in the town, and then people knew that you're like, look, I rolled randomly and they were all fascists, as opposed to like, why does Linda want to make everyone a fascist?
Yeah, so it inspires things that you would not have thought of, which is one of the main strengths of randomness in gameplay, is that it creates something that the GM wouldn't have thought of. It creates something that the players didn't expect, and
you
it
can
makes
create
surprises
a lore
in every
reason
corner.
too.
Yeah.
You can be like, well, you know what? This town was actually founded by runaway fascists from when an evil fascist empire 500 years ago was destroyed by a democratic revolution, and the survivors of the imperial family went to this village and founded it, and they've taught the love of fascism to all of their children since then, and they secretly want to restore the fascist empire someday.
Yes.
And that's why we rolled so many fascists here.
There you go. Yeah. Alrighty. Did you have anything else you wanted to discuss for
Those were the main things which I wanted to talk about: the randomness in resolutions, randomness in selecting what to do, and randomness in determining smaller features, and how you can either reroll or go with it and try to come up with an explanation when it doesn't make any sense to you at first. And these are ways that certain... You know, they used to be even more in style in some of the older school gameplay, but that kind of old school gameplay works in newer style RPGs as well. And it can even work in RPGs that have like players and GMs coming up with concepts and ideas that are more narrative based. If you're like, let's throw a random table in there too. If the players are on board for it, you can do that.
Yeah.
You could even have situations where the player is supposed to pick something and the GM is supposed to pick something, and there's like meta narrative currency where you could do something like, instead of spending my meta narrative currency to pick something like I'm supposed to be able to do here as a player, could I gain currency and roll on this random table of things? On a random and vaguely usually bad table of things to happen, because I'm thinking it would be interesting if something vaguely bad happened. I'd like to gain a meta-narrative currency to make a choice later on.
Yeah.
So you could even hack it into a system that's usually more prescriptive and allowing the players to make calls. There's lots that you can do, and there are whole topics that could be made only about some of the subcategories of things that we talked about. But as an overall overview of randomness and emergent gameplay, I think that we've covered everything I wanted to say. What about you, Linda?
Sounds good. Shall we say goodbye to YouTube?
Let's say goodbye to YouTube. Bye, YouTube!
Bye, YouTube!